Hi, Laura. I've been impatiently waiting to chat with you. I think you already know that.
Thanks.
We've been talking about this for a while.
Yeah, we have.
You were born in Ontario and grew up in Winnipeg.
Actually, I was born in Winnipeg.
Say that again?
I was born in Winnipeg and grew up there. Yeah.
Okay. In a family with Russian, Czech, and Ukrainian roots.
And Jewish as well, yeah.
And Jewish. So how leftovers playing such a big role in your work? How do you say leftovers in Ukrainian?
I don't know, actually. My grandparents that I grew up with were Jewish, Russian Jews, so they spoke Yiddish. And then on my mother's side, they were Ukrainian, but I wasn't as close with them, so I didn't ever learn Ukrainian. I just would listen to Yiddish.
Okay. So listen, your work is characterized by unmistakable delicacy and a sense of fragility and elegance. You must have heard that before, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you put a particular emphasis on A, looking, and B, picturing. What's the difference? And also tell us how and when seeing comes into play. You also use the term staring at the world, so many different words.
Mm-hmm. I guess as I understand it, there's often sight or the apprehension of senses is thought of as being a kind of neutral activity. You know, you see things and it seems like it's just a neutral kind of passive engagement where things come to one. But my understanding through, reading theory, critical theory, psychology, psychoanalysis, is that seeing any sensory apprehension is always going to be affected by one's involvement with the world. In other words, how one was raised, what one was exposed to. And so seeing itself is not passive or neutral, but we're taught to see. We're taught what to look at. We're taught what's important. It's so unconscious. It happens at such a sort of primal level. And so I'm really interested in the way that the camera interjects within what is otherwise, looking at the world. But the camera frames things in a particular way. And then I will argue that the camera has really affected how we see and how we understand the world and how we are in the world.
So seeing is culturally influenced. And of course, the camera, which sees with only one eye as opposed to two, which is the way we see, has its own way of apprehending the world.
Yeah, there's many differences. I mean, it's a single eye, it's monocular instead of binocular. It's static. It puts a frame around the world. We don't put frames around the world when we're looking. We see peripherally and we turn our head and we move. Everything's always in motion and everything's always relational. But the camera stops and frames and makes static. And what we pay attention to and how we pay attention to it, I will again argue that the camera is a very particular mode of describing space and time.
So you mentioned that you wrangle with established definitions of the social and intimate. Is that why you were attracted to Diane Arbus's work? Diane Arbus, in my book, had issues with empathy. Her images are never, if ever, kind, which is on the other side of the spectrum where your work is involved.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know. I guess I feel like there's something about the staring that Diane Arbus's work was kind of revelatory for me. Just like looking at something that you're not supposed to look at in a way that, I don't know, is it not kind? I'm trying to think. I hadn't considered that. I think that there is, I don't know if it's kind.
Look?
What's that?
Is it the intrusive look?
I don't know if it's intrusive. I think it's a particular point of view that she had of the world that was a kind of snarl, like, she was sort of looking, there's a kind of misanthropy to the work where everything gets looked at the same, whether it's I don't know, like a little child, a baby, or something that seems maybe one could maybe sneer at, but everything sort of gets put in that same, instead of rose-colored glasses, it's like sneer-colored glasses. But at the same time, there's something heart, for me, it makes something very, it opens my heart in a way because of the kind of vulnerability that I feel. And I feel towards the world. And I think about the child with the hand grenade, or the two teenagers in Harlem. I mean, there's so many of her images where my heart just goes out to those people that are in that moment, because I also feel like I could be them and I could be seen in that way. So it makes me realize my own vulnerability.
That's an interesting point of view. Listen, before I forget, what is that epic story about your grandparents on both sides? You mentioned it somewhere, but now we want to hear about it.
Oh, just about, I guess, I know a little bit about my grandparents. On my father's side, they left during the pogroms in the 1910s in Russia. My grandfather was from Kiev, and was a Jew living there. And his father left 9 years before the rest of the family was sent for. And so they had to survive. And my great grandmother rather, had a really tough life as a smuggler. And then I didn't know this. I mean, when I knew her, she was a bitter woman who never smiled. And I thought she was horrible. Like, I totally disliked her. She smelled bad and she never smiled and was in the corner of the room, kind of drying up, sort of desiccated. And then later on, I learned more about like how hard life had been for her. And I was like, oh, wow, I understand why somebody might take on that attitude. And then my grandfather also was kind of terrified of the world. My grandmother was different. My grandmother was very loving and open and generous, and she really took care of me. My parents were very young when they had me. And my grandmother had come to Canada when she was a teenage, she was 16. And she worked as a seamstress, and she was sort of the heart of the family. And being the heart of the family, there was also a kind of vulnerability and fragility to her. Like, she would hold everyone together, but she would also break. And I didn't know this, but she had a nervous breakdown and had been hospitalized at some point long before I was born. They lived really poor. Part of my ethos about looking at leftovers comes from, they never, ever, ever went to the counter where the fresh meat and fresh vegetables were. It was always like the bargain bin. And my grandmother was amazing at making what was like the cheapest, toughest cuts of meat into, really great food. And it was a part of just like Eastern European culture. Like, you didn't throw anything out. Nothing ever got thrown out. And, towards the end, it was kind of disgusting because things would be moldy. But when she was, when I was growing up, it was like, if there was an apple that was bruised, you cut off the bruised part and you ate the apple. And actually the apple tasted better because the more ripe fruit was sweeter.
There's haute cuisine now that is made out of
absolutely. I know. I find it so fascinating. And and she never threw plastic bags out. She washed plastic bags out and hung them on the clothesline to dry. And so a lot of the attitudes that people think of as being like haute cuisine or being recycling and being green. I mean, my grandparents did that because, economically, it was the only way they could survive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Your father, with whom you made art as a kid, didn't want you to go to art school. And he wasn't all that wrong, really, as a parent.
No, not at all.
After all, how many of your students today end up as artists?
Yeah, it's a hard job.
It's a hard job, yes. Not a lot of artists make a living out of their work.
Nope. I knew that early on.
You did?
Yeah.
So did you love him more for that? Did you appreciate the intention behind all that?
Oh, no, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, I told you also that he died in an accident when I was 18.
Yes.
And so I started out in interior design because he didn't want me to go into art school.
Commercial,
Yeah, and I probably would have been a really unhappy interior designer and then had a nervous breakdown at some point. But because he died, I had a kind of freedom to then go into art school. And also his death made me feel that I might as well do something that I wanted to do, because indeed one could die at any moment. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that I'm standing on my own 2 feet and that I was prepared pragmatically to work another job while I made my art. And teaching, thankfully, I enjoyed it and I think I'm good at it. And so it's something that I also really love to do.
So how is that? How is teaching for you? Is that fulfilling?
Very, yeah. I really enjoy teaching. I enjoy working with students and trying to help them speak a different language than one that they're familiar with, and to show them that art isn't just about, I don't know, like solely about a Sunday afternoon once a year going to a museum and looking at art for like
Right.
pleasure. Yeah, or personal expression, but that there are ideas, and one can be expressive of conceptual things as well as emotional things. And I also really appreciate what they teach me, which, humility.
Do you sometimes see yourself in them?
Yeah, and I learn, there's things that as I get older, I have things that I like, that I believe, like I have my belief system, and they challenge my belief system and they help me grow. So trying to understand why they're attracted to things or interested in things, it keeps me fresh.
Yeah, they certainly keep us on our toes.
Absolutely, yes.
So you had this conversation with a teacher after your first semester and suddenly understood how to communicate with photography. What was that about?
When I started out in art school, it was my 3rd year of college because I'd gone through interior design and then through architecture. And then I was in my 3rd year and I got accepted into the School of Art, barely. I think it was by the skin of my teeth, but I did. And I couldn't take painting, which is what I wanted to take, because I hadn't done some of the prerequisites. You had to take a year-long drawing course in the program I was in. But I could take photography, which I think is sort of funny in retrospect, because I think photography would need drawing just as much as painting. But anyways, so I took photography, and my father had been an avid photographer. He had given me a camera when I was younger that I never really used, and I just didn't really understand it. I just sort of thought you took pictures of things that I didn't really get. I didn't really understand it. And then I did. What's that?
And a lot of the time they were for events.
Yeah, it was for events, or portraits, or you take pictures of things, like of quirky things,
Right.
of weird things.
Right.
And I didn't understand why anyone would do that. It just didn't make any sense to me. And then when I was in my first semester of photography, I did really poorly. And the professor who was teaching the course, Joanne Johnson, said, if anyone wants to come speak with me, I'm happy to see you in office hours. So I went and talked with her, and I showed her the pictures that I had, and we looked at them. And she's like, well, this just isn't doing, like, it isn't doing anything. Like, I could walk by this and see this. Like, what are you doing by making a picture of it? The picture's not doing anything. And when she said that, I was like, oh, like the photograph has to do something in addition to just pointing. And I realized that the drawing classes that I'd been taking, the idea of, composition, form, that all of those aspects were as important in photography as they were in drawing and in painting. And then suddenly I realized that part of it, the frame, was about framing the world in a way where the photograph did something to the way that you're seeing the world. And that was just then I started making photographs, and everything kind of changed for me.
Then the importance of cropping must have come to the fore.
Yeah, cropping, definitely. Absolutely. Depth of field. I was working in black and white, so value or tone.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you speak of your encounter in Italy with Morandi's work. and the tension between what the painting is truly about and what the painting seems to portray. In other words, the jugs and the pots in the paintings are not what the paintings are really about. Yes?
Yes.
Can you expand on that?
Sure. First, I also want to say that I'm going to be in a show with Morandi this summer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Congratulations. That must be very
I know.
exciting.
I'm so excited at the Academy Museum. And so it's me and Morandi. I'm really excited about it. Yeah, I guess, you know, I always really loved
Sounds like the title of a book, Me and Morandi.
Oh, I like that. I always had liked his work, but I didn't know what it was about. Like I would look at them and they attracted me, and I would try and read articles or essays about them, and I just never understood it. And then again, you know, through the photographs that I was making, and also actually, you know what the difference was with seeing it in real life?
Yeah.
I'd seen reproductions, and I had the same moment with Mondrian, also where I saw the work in real life. And when I first saw it, I thought it was a disgusting little ugly thing. And then I was like, oh, it's a painting. It's not a really slick, you know, print, white, like really hard contrast, whatever. It's like, it's about the paint and about the touch and about the intimacy. And so when I first saw Morandi in person, I was blown away by the physicality and yeah, just, you know, it's the sense of a hand making those decisions, a hand and an eye and a body and a brain, making those decisions about the delicacy.
Yeah, but there's this, the light is so staggering. The light that comes out of the paintings is amazing. And
Yeah.
of course, Joel Meyrowitz did a whole thing about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's different. I mean, it's interesting with Meyrowitz's work. I haven't seen it in person. I've only seen reproductions of it. I guess there's just, for me, still the Morandi, there's something about the physicality and the singularity of it. And I think that's a difference. I mean, that's something I struggle with photography is the coolness, you know, of the printing. And I was a real holdout for C prints, for chromogenic prints, because I really loved the physicality of them. And then finally I had to give up because it just became impossible to get C prints made.
Yes.
I was a real holdout though. And yeah, I feel like now photography has become so much more about image than its presence as a physical object.
Yes, it's unfortunate to hold a photograph in the hand, to feel the paper, to look at the nuances of the image, to read the image in a sort of intimate way is a very particular type of experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the size of it.
No glass.
Yeah.
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 But yeah, how long do you think it took Morandi to learn to paint like that? It didn't happen overnight.
All of his life. I think he was always learning to paint. And that's also one of the things. I mean, I think with the work, you know, I feel, or I imagine I feel, his effort. I mean, his trying, you know, his looking, his like weighing and balancing. It feels like you can experience the process of like the slight subtle tonal variations, or like the fraction of a millimeter of this being over here or that being over there.
Yes.
And you're engaged, you know, at looking at the work, I experienced that process of decision making.
Yes. You know, Alex Katz once said something to the effect that he can almost guess a painter's age by looking at his work, because he knows how long it takes to learn how to paint.
That's funny. It's probably true.
Yeah. So you say the palpability of the object in photographs is just a promise, but never more than just that, because the promise never materializes. Do you feel that most people are unaware that an image sacred or secular is but a representation, and that at least once removed from reality?
I think it depends on what image we're talking about. I mean, I've also done readings and thinking about icons, from religious icons to thinking about images of, images of presidents or Chairman Mao, or Lenin, or different statues of different, figures, and the way that they have been privileged within society, and they attain the status of a religious icon. And then I'm also really interested in aniconism, which is the prohibition of animate objects, and the way that that gets circumnavigated in Catholicism because of the necessity to make the word visual. I think for the most part, mainstream imagery, mainstream advertisements give us a promise that we aspire to, that we want. They're selling us an idea. And I feel very much that photography is mired in capitalism and consumer culture. And I feel like it's part of a long, like a 2,000-year-long trajectory that comes from Catholicism, about trying to sell a way of being in the world, which was Catholicism, and tithing to the popes and all of that, that now has become different God or gods. Now it's capitalism and consumer culture, where Calvin Klein jeans or underwear, or anything. I talk to my college students about why did they decide to come to the university, and I hold up the brochure for the university, and I'm like, let's talk about this as like a sales tactic. Like, look at the fonts, look at the color choices, look at the images that are being shown. You're being sold, something. And I feel like that's so much everywhere it predominates, which is why sometimes I get periodically disgusted with photography, and I feel like I can't do it anymore. But then I kind of get back, I find my own place in it again.
But communication is always a form of selling something.
It's true. Yeah.
Even education is selling something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you can't discount that. On the other hand, I think most people are capable of compartmentalizing, the commercial part of everyday life, and then the real part of life, the fundamental part. And they're able to tell the difference. Well, not everybody, but to various degrees. But it's pretty obvious when we.
I don't know. I think that there's a lot of. I think you can tell the difference, but I think that people's aspirations, again, in terms of what they want to do. I'm really the sort of disturbance from 2007 with the iPhone or the smartphone and Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat. And, the idea of, for instance, young women putting on makeup so that they look good for their selfies, or making food that looks good for your Instagram photograph. Not the taste, doesn't have to taste good. It just has to look good. I feel like, people, I don't know, arranging flowers again, so it can look good for an Instagram photograph. So it's not again about an experience that is holistic, but it's about having things look good in a photograph. And I feel increasingly that people, it's been like that for a long time, going back to Dutch Flemish Renaissance painting. The paintings of the home, of the interior, were to advertise that this was the life that you should aspire to. You should want these lemons and these, this Chinese porcelain and this crystal goblet. And if you work really hard and are a good citizen and, participate in the community, you too could have access to this. And I feel like that, it goes directly into Irving Penn still lifes and Clinique ads and all that, Martha Stewart, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but you have to distinguish the intention behind the act, and all intentions are not the same. I'll tell you an interesting story. I went to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa, and I couldn't get close to it. Because it's not very big. I couldn't get close to it because there were 20 rows of people with their backs turned to the Mona Lisa, taking selfies of themselves with the Mona Lisa. So that says something about what we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a very dramatic example of that.
And also, like, people even going, like, years ago, 20 years ago, I think the first time, maybe longer, 30 years ago, the first time I went to Europe and sort of did my grand tour, go look at masters. I just remember being in one museum, I think it was the Accademia in Venice, and there was somebody who barged in, and it was sort of like the typical kind of like ugly American tourist who was like, "Where's the Rembrandts? I want to see the Rembrandts." And the guard very nicely in an Italian accent was like, "Sir, we don't have any Rembrandts here." And then he was like, okay, I'm leaving, like forget the Titians, forget the, whatever else, right?
So let's talk about mirrors in your work. Mirrors that appear periodically in your work in a way that sort of bifurcates reality, but in such a manner that it causes us to want to know what's in both. The one pictured straight on and the other one barely seen through the mirror. And of course, to disorient us even more, you play with parallax. And so it's a very interesting play with mirrors, or the use of mirrors in your imagery. You want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. I mean, I guess the first time I started using mirrors was when I was doing the Venus inferred work, the photographs of couples.
Yes.
And I realized that what I was seeing in the mirror was different than what the photograph was describing, and it changed the way that the space was described. And I wanted to use that to, again, talk about the different perspectives, because I was photographing mostly two people with the couples. And for me, a lot of that work was about, again, this idea of perspective. I thought a lot about sort of the sort of primal scene that Freud talks about, where the child sees their parents in bed, and the idea of being an observer, Laura Mulvey's ideas about looking and who's in power and who's being subject and who's the object. So I was thinking about conflicting or contrasting points of view. And then I was also just thinking about, maybe in a like sort of, again, modernist way, like futurism, or, how do you incorporate movement? Like it's not just one or the other, but there's a myriad of different perspectives. And I always want for my pictures to be unstable, and for there to be just like a little bit of a jiggle with the parallax, so that they don't sit, there's not just one single point from which everything moves out from, but rather there's contradicting cues to destabilize that authority of the photograph. So the mirror can sometimes help me do that, but I've also been thinking a lot about doubling and tripling, and I play with that a lot in my work too, where shadows will double, or a second object that is like another object will kind of act as a double in the scene, and it feels almost like it's been moved, or there's a kind of like psychic break or something with the way that it appears.
Yeah, it creates a tension.
Yeah.
But a picture without tension is not an interesting picture, really. There has to be tension.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, for me, there has to be tension with the photographs. It's something that, and attention not just about the subject matter. Like, I feel like there's a lot of work where there's pictures of things that seem controversial. And I'm not usually interested in a lot of that work, because I feel like, again, it's sort of like finger pointing. And I don't know that the otherness of what is being described makes the picture a good picture. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so it's again a matter of intention, what the intent is behind that.
I don't know. I place less belief in intention. I think that intention is a part of the image, but it's a smaller part than the reception. I know this. I feel like I know this because my students will intend lots of things and they miss the mark. Like the pictures don't necessarily do what they intend. So I'm always a little bit suspicious about intention.
Somebody said once, and I can't remember who it was, that a person that we are communicating with hears not what we're saying, but what we think we are saying. So that's an interesting proposition. In other words, they hear the intent more so than the plain statement.
I sort of subscribe to Derrida's notion that, I think he said something, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's something to the effect of a letter never reaches its recipient. And he doesn't mean that the letter goes astray, but he means that whatever it is that you say or you write, it isn't received, because what the person receives,
yes.
they hear it differently. They interpret it to their own whatever. And so that gap of language, it's something that I think a lot is language, the way that we use language and the way that we're enculturated to use language, and then the way that photographs are a language.
You said that your purpose was to thwart the photographic vision. Is that a creative strategy, or do you have some other intent behind that, another reason? And what happens after you've done that? How does it feel then? And what's that about?
It's, I guess, more ideological, if anything. Again,
Ideological.
it goes again in the, some of the stuff we we're talking about consumer culture. I don't want the picture to be satisfying like chocolate ice cream. I mean, I love chocolate ice cream, but I don't want the pictures to be purely palatable, but I want there to be a kind of disruption of expectations, or again, that sense of unease that I talked about, because I want to disrupt, I want people to be cognizant that photographs are not real. And I want to provide an unreliable narrative that then causes people to look at other photographs and to be suspicious and to not be so easily consuming. And also, I mean, for me, I am subject. I'm the first person to admit my guilt in complicity with photographs. Like, I like fashion, I like design. I look at a ton of stuff online and magazines and everything. Like, I love it. And I'm also really like, I spend too much money on stupid things that I don't really need because they look really pretty. But I'm really interested in that idea of the way that seeing sets up this desire. There's this great essay by Christian Metz called The Photograph as Fetish. And it's something that I also really subscribe to, that the photograph is fetish. And that's partially, I mean, that's why, not partially, that is why there's such a proliferation of photography, because no one photograph satisfies. We just need more, and we're never satisfied. And sort of like objects too, we're never satisfied. We just want more.
Trying to define things in particular photography is an impossible task. So
it's a vehicle for communication. It's a way of talking about this stuff.
There's a bit of Don Quixote in us,
Absolutely.
we fight windmills. So in 2004, you have this novel idea, and I'm very jealous that I didn't get that idea before you did, to photograph homes after the owners have moved out. I think it's a very clever idea. So, Buddhists have a term, the term shul, to indicate a path or trace left by something or someone. And in particular, if you leave a dead body on grass, that grass doesn't grow back for a very long time, sometimes for years or decades. So is that trace that's left by things and people. So photographing people's home after they're gone strikes me primarily as a forensic exercise, therefore eminently photographic or photogenic. And yet, in the end, you say it didn't work out. And I'm curious, what is it that eluded your camera? What is it that failed to materialize? Was it the right emotion wasn't there, or what happened?
I guess for me, what didn't work out, or what worked out maybe too succinctly, was I had an idea, and my thesis was sort of too easily proven, was that a home isn't just the walls and the structure, which the photographs ended up looking much more like abstract color-filled painting. But they didn't have the richness of a painting because, of course, they're photographic. And so while the image resembled, very sort of minimal color-filled painting with little hints of something that had been there, there wasn't the richness of the materiality. And so I felt like I got too quickly to a point where I sort of proved what I was setting out to show, and then there were no questions for me in there. I didn't know how to make the photographs have, I didn't know how to make the photograph have that sense that you just described, the Buddhist shul, is it? Yeah, the photograph didn't have it. Instead, I was picturing that.
Yeah, yeah.
While the space might have had it, my photographs didn't. And I ended up, I printed the photographs quite large and I showed them, and I was really unhappy with the show. And then more recently, probably about 2 years ago, I reprinted, gosh, I think there's maybe 20 images. I reprinted them as smaller, sort of like 16 by 20 images. And I like them much more in a series as the 16 by 20 images, because they reinforce this idea of the home as a kind of container or a vessel, but also as a kind of empty vessel, as a flat vessel that refuses in some way to have that perfume, because they're empty. They don't, they're a shell. And so it worked out better for me when I reprinted them as really beautiful, smaller prints, rather than having them as very large sort of plastic objects that just didn't work.
You know, besides the fact that the smaller scale always emphasizes composition, which you're very good at, which you're very good at. It concentrates the light also.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, Sally Mann photographed some major American artists' home, and it was exhibited at Gagosian. Right? I don't remember the name of the artist, and it wasn't very emotionally charged. It was just a documentary to me, even though it was presented as a major body of work. To me, it didn't do that much for me. But that's another story. But it's difficult to do. It's a difficult task, really, to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think too often the pictures end up being a picture, you know, pictures of things versus
documentary, really.
Photographs. Yeah.
So in 2006, you move into a new studio space and you experience photographer's block, and you start photographing just about anything, yet with a sense that there was no there. A quality that you also attribute to the times you were living in at the time. But still, in the end, it all came out all right, and beautiful work emerged from that period. So how did it write itself? What happened?
I think, you know, it was a kind of Morandi-like thing where I realized that the photographs weren't necessarily about what was in them.
Yeah.
Rather, it was how I was composing them, and a kind of attentiveness and looking became, it was a very quiet time. I loved that studio that I had at that point. No, I have a different studio that I don't like as much. And it's embarrassing because my studio is beautiful. My studio is fabulous right now. But that studio that I had there had the most extraordinary light. It had Western light, huge windows facing the west. And it was just, yeah. I missed that studio. It was a special studio. I made a lot of work there that I really liked. Yeah.
If we get attached to our cameras, which don't do as much as the new cameras and so on and so forth, I mean, there are certain special qualities about things, and we get imprinted on them or something. You know?
Yeah, they're really hard to shake off.
Yeah. So you have a new baby now, and you can no longer work in the mornings because there's a feeding time and all that. And that must have been a huge adjustment because you normally work with available light, right?
Yeah.
So everything changes now, the contrast, the diffusion of the light, how the light distributes and reverberates against the walls, off of the subjects, the reflections, so on and so forth. It was a relearning, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, you know, I think that, you know, back to 2006, I mean, always, and this even goes back to graduate school. When I was in graduate school, it was a time when people were doing very large, more theatrical kinds of work that would involve, cherry pickers and a cast of actors and film crew. It was sort of the big photograph like Gursky and Greg Crutzen and some of those people. And while I liked their work, I also felt that there was something very macho about it. Like I needed to have a lot of money. I needed to have like a whole crew. Otherwise I couldn't make work. And going back to my grandparents, part of it was like, no, you don't make work. Or actually, this is a Gary Winogrand quote. You don't make art because of life, you make art despite life. And I remember thinking that, I don't need all that stuff. Like, what is it I need to make work? The only thing I need to make work is what's around me. And I was also thinking about Surek, who was interned in his house in Czechoslovakia for a couple of years and made those gorgeous still lifes, very quiet little still lifes. And I'm like, I've always told myself, because I wrestle with this because I like objects, that I don't need that. Like, what is it I need and what is it I want? And trying to distinguish between need and want. Again, this goes to photography. Like photography shows me all the stuff that I want, but do I really need all of it? And so trying to reconcile myself to, well, what's available to me? This is what's available to me, is this light at this time and working in this other way. And there were a number of other personal things that were going on besides having a new child. It was a very fraught time, 2008, 2009, 2010. And I just felt like I had to soldier on and just figure out what really mattered and using what I could. And I also feel like there's a feminist statement in there, again, about I don't have the time or resources or money or need for this huge, big kind of thing. Instead, I think about smallness. And again, I think about smallness. I think about fragility. I think about delicacy. I think about utility and necessity. And those are my values. And so I brought myself, I always have to bring myself, I feel like a helium balloon. I have to bring myself back down to being like, wait, like, I don't need that stuff over there. What I need is like this right here, and dealing with this right here. And so that's where I found myself in 2009, 2010.
But those are wonderful moments of clarity, aren't there?
They are. I mean, it's ground zero.
Yeah, you are very clear about what matters and what doesn't really matters.
Yep.
I think that André Cartèche, when he got very old and he had an apartment on Fifth Avenue, the beginning of Fifth Avenue, I think he couldn't leave his apartment anymore. And I'm not sure. He did a lot of wonderful works just shooting from his window.
Yep.
And that's all he had.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to go to Africa,
right? Exactly.
To make wonderful pictures of whatever it is that you photograph in Africa. Speaking of which, you started very seriously working in ceramics, but you also went to India, where you collaborated on weaving tapestries.
Mm-hmm.
And the question that came to me was, did you put photography aside during that time? Did you have your cameras with you in India?
I didn't have my 4x5 because that's what I was using at the time. So I didn't bring that with me. I had my iPhone. And I'm also, thinking about
model.
What's that?
The latest model with the highest definition.
Well, at that point, it was 2010. So whatever that model was, yeah. But I also want to, I love my 4x5, and part of it, the last few years, as it's become increasingly difficult to work with a 4x5, trying to deal with the changing technology. And I'm interested in the iPhone and what the iPhone gives us, and what it means to work with an iPhone. And so when I was in India, I didn't bring my cameras. I just had my iPhone. And I did these I started being really just fascinated by the grounds, like literally the ground, because the grounds were so rich. Particularly, I was in Bangalore. And I just remember the flower market in Bangalore that starts at 5 a.m. and it goes until about 9:30 or 10 when it gets too hot. And then it closes down for the day. But as it closes down for the day, and the cows and the monkeys and the elephants go through, and the cars and the bikes and the tuk-tuks and everything else, gladiolas, roses, this crazy array of flowers, marigolds, like fields of marigolds, become just the ground. And I just started photographing these grounds and trying to sort of casually grid them out with my iPhone. And then I went back to Bombay, and I stumbled into what was a wedding the night before, and the ground was covered in flowers and cigarette butts and broken plastic wine glasses. And again, I just tried to grid the ground because it was so amazing. And there were these other flowers while I was running that I found. I think they're called alabeza. So I had these different surfaces, and then I came back to Chicago and I put them into these grids, and I composed them to make these compositions that I liked. And I tried printing them, and they were not so interesting. Again, the lack of, what's that?
Because
there wasn't the same material richness that the grounds had. There just wasn't a material richness. And at the time, I'd just done a project with John Paul Morabito. I did a series of napkins that are sustainably sourced, that have a stain that's woven into them.
Yes.
And I was thinking about our fetish for white and whiteness, and the idea of purity and cleanliness in minimalist art, but I also thinking about race. And I was saying, why can't we just accept stains? Like what's wrong with a stain? Like, why do we have to throw things out once they get a stain on them? And also, getting older, having wrinkles and having scars on my body.
Irritating.
What's that?
Because they are irritating.
But why are they irritating? I mean, this is something, again, like the thing is still useful if it has a stain on it, but we reject it, right? Like, and wrinkles, like why are wrinkles bad? Like, why are scars bad? And so I wanted
trends in fashion, really.
What's that?
Those are trends in fashion.
It's not just a trend.
No, in fashion there are these trends where you wear grunge, or where you wear
but still, if you have a stain on any of that stuff, it's still not good. Like, you're not supposed to wear, I don't know, a $5,000 leather jacket that has a stain on it, right? Because that would be, you'd ruin it if it had a stain on it. So there's still a protocol around those things. And I was thinking, and again, like if you're old and you have wrinkles and scars, that's not cool either. So I was thinking about why can't we just change our aesthetic sensibility? So instead we embrace the stain, we embrace the wrinkle, we embrace the scar as being a sign of a life that is lived. And it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. So I'd made these napkins with my collaborator, and then he's a weaver. John Paul Morabito is a really great artist weaver, and he saw these images and he said, I want to weave these on his jacquard loom. So we did this collaboration where we made these beautiful tapestries.
Talking about India, I remember we made the huge mistake of traveling by bus with my wife, and because the roads are, as you know, impassable practically, but the vision through the windows was incredibly beautiful, because there were the fields dotted with these farmer women in their bright saris, dotting the landscape, and they were like blooms in the distance. It was just remarkable. Talking about India.
Yeah.
Going back to your work, at some point, objects in your work are sort of replaced by arrangements of, is it appropriated images, and light, as you say, becomes your dancing partner. And the signature way of looking and seeing the light, the space, is still in that work, because that's really your visual brand, isn't it?
I guess so.
So no matter what you do, it's always there. No matter what you do and how you do it, that is always present.
Yeah, I mean, more recently I've been working with artificial light, trying to figure it out. But definitely there's compositional light strategies that and color, palette that I always lean on.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to see.
Thanks.
So I gather photography is very important to you. Is it something that is always with you? Something without which it would be harder to get up in the morning?
I can't even imagine it because it's such an entrenched part of our world. I don't, you know, it's I don't even think about it like that. It's just always present. But I will say that it's also something that I enjoy in many situations leaving behind. I mean, there's a lot of times where I'm traveling or I'm having an experience where people will say, well, why aren't you taking a picture? And I don't want to take a picture because I want to experience it. And that's also important to me, is what, you know, is how I use it. I think about it as a vehicle or as a material. And when I want to communicate with it, I use it. And then there's many times for many kinds of experiences where it would belittle the experience to take a picture at that moment.
You know, Joseph Kudelka was asked once why he was taking the pictures that he was taking that he may never use. And he had a wonderful response. And his response was, because it had to be taken. And that was it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we photographers know what that really means, you know, because we take pictures for no reason at all, sometimes. But there is a reason, and the reason is because it had to be taken.
Yeah. And sometimes it has to not be taken.
And sometimes it has to not be taken. Yeah. So, listen, you are a respected artist, and you published several books. And out of your entire body of work, what image of you do you want to emerge when your name is first mentioned? What have you been expressing all this time?
Oof. Let me ask you a question before I answer that. Do you mean one of my photographs, or a photograph of me, or rather a kind of image of me?
What is the sense of you do you want to emerge out of the totality of your body of work when you're brought up, when it's brought up? When somebody says Laura Letinsky, what do you think would come to mind immediately? You would want to come to mind immediately?
Oh, that's a hard question. It's funny because I'm just going to digress for a moment. I was talking to my students the other day because we were talking about craft and art, and we had to read a little bit of Kant because one has to read a little bit of Kant to talk about some of these issues. And the term genius. And I started to ask the students, I'm like, when do you hear the term genius? To whom does that term get used? And we named sort of some qualities around it. And then I said, okay, so name some figures who are geniuses, who've been named geniuses. And of course, everyone they named was a white man. Isn't that interesting? Yes. I said, what would it be like if women were called geniuses? So I don't know that I'd want to be called a genius, but I guess I'd like people to think about.
But you know, geniuses are often monsters.
That's true.
So
yeah, so I don't necessarily aspire to that, but I do wish it was used a little more generously with women and other people. But anyways, what would I want? I don't know. I guess I feel like I'm trying to think of adjectives that I would want. You know, intelligent, making beautiful work, thoughtful, fragility, delicacy, some of the stuff that you started out speaking of.
But what is your artistic legacy, do you think?
That's a tough question. Do I have to determine that?
Is that?
I don't know how to answer that question. I think that what I hope I've done is to open up some questions about how we understand the world through photography, and that the photography isn't the way that we understand the world, but encourage a kind of holistic, experiential contact of the world. And also that, you know, perfection is a problem and imperfection is much more about being alive and process. And I am interested again in, you know, I talk about delicacy and fragility not as simply aesthetic categories, but I think of them again in relation to politics. I'm much more interested in proposition, in fragility, in tentativeness as political strategies than bombast or certitude or largesse. Like I think about those in relation to somebody like Trump. And I think the world would be a lot better of a place if negotiation and balance and harmony and you know, questioning and answering, if those were more a part of our world.
You know, when you ask somebody what they want, most of the time they answer by telling you what they don't want. Because it's hard for them to formulate what they do want or to get in touch with that. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit what you're doing now, because it's difficult for you to, and I understand that. Mm-hmm. It's difficult for the eye to see itself, so to speak. Yeah.
And it's hard to know how one's work is framed. I mean, obviously I've read things about myself, but that also riffs off of whatever else I've already put out there. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. You tell me, what would be my artistic legacy?
Well, I think for me, and I like to leave the mental aside because it's not how I function. Mm-hmm. I live through my eyes mostly. Mm-hmm. And I think I would say beauty and elegance, kindness, and a lot of curiosity.
I like curiosity.
Yes, you're very curious. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say. If I thought about it longer, I might come up with something else or more. But that's what I think sums up a lot of the work that you've done. And inquisitiveness also. Mm-hmm.
I like those. I mean, I especially like acquisitiveness and curiosity because they feel very ongoing to me, like process.
That's the driving force.
Yeah.
But in the end, it has to be expressed on the surface. You know, it has to be expressed on a two-dimensional surface. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the driving force. Mm-hmm. So an easier question for you. Mm-hmm. If you had to do it all over again at Yale, would you stick with an MFA in photography?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
After all the things that you've said about photography, the false promises and everything else.
Again, I feel like I'm such a little small part of it. You know, when there's, 500 billion photographs or something uploaded to TikTok every day, like I'm just such a small part. I mean, my involvement in photography is a little, not even a blip in the world. For me, it's a way, it is like speaking a language. And I really very much think about it in relation to writing. And I've been involved. There's a fabulous image text program that two people, a writer and a photographer, run. Now it's going to be out of Cornell. And I really like the relationship between image. It's Nicholas Molnar and Catherine Taylor. And their interest in image and text and the way that they reinforce and undermine each other is really interesting to me. And I think that, you know, the way that language is produced out of a culture, I think photographs work very similarly. And that's really, it's again, an ongoing fascination. And it keeps on evolving. I mean, technologically, it's changed so much, even in my short lifetime.
Yeah, but that has to do with the fact that I think no part can ever express the whole.
Yeah.
And what we have access to is parts of things.
Mhm.
Well, Laura, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It has been a delightful, delightful chat.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And I will definitely let you know
Mhm.
when it appears online.
Okay. Thanks so much, Raphael. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Take care, Laura.
Bye.
Bye.